Today from the global lane, Israel's Operation Strength and Sword, growing opposition to Hamas and the torturous death of a Palestinian who spoke out against them.
Hamas will suppress any dissent, any attempt to overthrow it from within with everything that it's got.
Donald Trump threatens to bomb Iran. Will they give up their nuclear weapons program?
They understand they're dealing with, as Vice President J.D. Vance says, a new sheriff in town. They're more likely to back down.
Trump's tariffs now in effect. Will America's neighbor to the north reciprocate?
There's nothing that Canada can do by way of reciprocal tariffs that are going to impact the United States very much.
Nationwide rulings from activist district court judges block President Trump's voter mandate.
They just want to get to their preferred outcome regardless of what the rule of law said.
And it's all right here on the global lane. Remove Hamas and release all the remaining hostages or face a large-scale evacuation and military operation. That ultimatum for the Palestinians from Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, who warns Operation Strength and Sword is about to crush Hamas once and for all and seize large areas of Gaza to expand Israel's security zone. Well, joining us with more is Jewish News Syndicate Editor-in-Chief Jonathan Tobin. Jonathan, it sounds like the IDF means serious business this time with Operation Strength and Sword. So won't this risk the lives of the remaining hostages? Many of their family members, I'm sure, are concerned about this operation.
It's possible that that is true. This is a very difficult dilemma for Israel because it does, there is strong support within Israel, and the intention of the Israeli government as well is to do everything it can to save and get those hostages out. On the other hand, Hamas has no real intention of seriously negotiating their release without ensuring their survival as being in power in Gaza. That which presents an ongoing threat of more terrorism, more October 7th style attacks on Israel. And that just means more Israelis being put in harm's way, as well as, quite frankly, the West in general, because Hamas, it views all of the West, the United States too, as their enemies.
Well, it doesn't seem like the Palestinians want Hamas to remain in power. We saw massive protests recently against Hamas, and then we learned that 22-year-old Uday Nasser el-Rabi, who participated in those protests, was kidnapped and beaten, tortured for hours with clubs and metal rods, and stabbed to death with screwdrivers. So what more can you tell us about that, and how are the Palestinians reacting to this atrocity committed by Hamas against one of their own?
Well, it's not clear exactly where Palestinian public opinion stands right now. Hamas has retained the support of most of the people under its control, and as well as in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, because, a generation of Palestinians has been indoctrinated into the idea that their only purpose is to wage war against Israel and against Israel's existence. But their suffering in Gaza is immense. And it's clear that many Palestinians in Gaza would like not to be be living in these conditions. They want the war to end. Hamas cannot allow the war to end on any terms, but with them winning, with them holding on to hostages, with them remaining in power. That's incompatible with Israeli security and, quite frankly, with the safety of Palestinians as well. It's not clear how many Palestinians really are taking to the streets or are willing to resist Hamas. But the one thing we know for sure is that Hamas will suppress any dissent, any attempt to overthrow it from within with everything that it's got, because that's how totalitarian regimes work. That's how Islamist regimes work. That's how their patrons in Iran, the Ayatollahs, the people who run the tyrannical regime in Iran, that's how they retain power.
Well, let's talk about Iran. President Trump's making headlines in a war of words with Iran. He says there will be bombing of Iran if the Ayatollah doesn't negotiate a nuclear deal. And then the Ayatollah responded, calling for the destruction of Israel, threatening to deliver a strong blow against the U.S. So are these just wishful thinkings on the part of weakened Iran, or do they have the capability to do real harm here?
Well, one should never underestimate the ability of the world's leading state sponsor of terror to inflict some pain on the rest of the world. They're veterans at that, but they are much weakened. Their allies in their auxiliaries in Lebanon, Hezbollah, have been much weakened. The regime in Syria, which was their ally, has been taken out. The Houthis in Yemen, although they're still firing missiles, they're under fire from the West and from Israel. They're in not a strong position. Moreover, they no longer have a weak government in the United States, in Washington, that seeks to appease them. President Trump has offered Iran an exit ramp, basically saying, if you negotiate a deal with us to get rid of your nuclear program, which is what, quite frankly, Barack Obama should have done back in 2015, 10 years ago, instead of appeasing Iran, then, President Trump has shown himself willing to make some sort of a deal that would allow the Ayatollahs to remain in power as long as they give up their nuclear weapons and stop being a threat to the region. That's not a price they appear willing to pay at this moment. Times have changed. They are much weakened, and it's time for them to take that into account. And if they don't, it will go hard on them.
Well, we keep hearing about sleeper cells, Iranian terrorists inside the U.S. So how concerned should we be about that?
Well, we should never not be concerned. I don't know how real that threat is. I have to hope that our intelligence services in the United States are focused on that and that they are prepared. Too often our intelligence services have been focused on other things. Quite frankly, if they do something like that, they should expect the worst from the United States. So I think, I think the Iranians, despite their bluster, they understand they're dealing with, as Vice President J.D. Vance says, a new sheriff in town. I would imagine they're more likely to back down rather than to challenge the United States, now led by President Trump.
Okay, peace through strength. As always, Jonathan Tobin, Jewish News Syndicate, thank you for joining us and providing those insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Donald Trump called April 2nd Liberation Day, the day set for reciprocal tariffs to take effect. Most tariffs on goods imported into the United States increased to 25%, with the exception of China and energy from Canada capped at 10%. Well, joining us with more about the effect of tariffs on relations with Canada is host of the Gray Matter podcast, Canadian attorney and political commentator Leighton Gray. Leighton, Ontario Premier Doug Ford said he'll inflict as much pain as possible on America for these tariffs. So what do you think? What can he do in response?
Well, the answer is very little. I mean, the numbers don't lie. America only does about 1% of its trade with Canada, and only about 24% of America's GDP is dependent upon trade globally. Canada, on the other hand, is highly dependent on trade with the U.S. In fact, about 3/4 of our trade is with the U.S. So actually, Mr. Ford is he's blovinating as is sort of his habit, unfortunately. Really, there's nothing that Canada can do by way of reciprocal tariffs that are going to impact the United States very much. The people who are really going to be hurt by all of this are the end consumers, because as people should understand, a tariff is another word for tax. And although governments, whether it's the U.S. government or the Canadian government, may take in more money due to tariffs, all that money is going to come from consumers. So when you go out to buy your Toyota or your Hyundai or some vehicle that's being imported into the United States is going to cost 25% more, you can be sure that all that cost is going to be passed on to the consumer. And that's the real problem with these tariffs.
Well, mostly the 25% tariffs will hurt Canadian cars coming into the United States. And Ford said the tariff increase could annihilate Ontario's auto industry. But aren't many of the vehicles excluded from the 25% tariff if they include U.S. parts?
Well, this is an interesting thing that you bring up, and that is it's not clear where the vehicles are actually made. And some of the parts are made in the United States, some are made in Canada, some are made in Mexico. The Canadian auto industry, such as it is really a finishing place. That is, the vehicles are assembled in Canada ultimately, and then they're shipped to the United States. It's not a situation where the vehicles are being totally assembled and made in Canada. So these are sort of some of the nuances in the tariffs that are really hard to figure out, and that have many people, even within the Trump administration, scratching their heads. The real question is, I guess there's two. Number one, how serious is Trump about tariffs? I think thus far we have to say pretty serious. And secondly, what is the real purpose that he's trying to serve through the tariffs, especially in relation to Canada? I'm not convinced that Donald Trump is using tariffs to actually get a trade advantage in relation to Canada. The U.S. already has a really great trade deal with Canada, despite what Mr. Trump says. And so I think that actually there's a deeper purpose behind what Mr. Trump is doing with tariffs, at least in relation to Canada.
Well, what is that then, Leighton? What is he really after? Does he just want open borders? And I'm not talking about physical borders, but economic ones?
Well, I think he's told us. If you go back to some of his earlier tweets, I think his deep concern, when you drill down, is military security of the continent. People should understand, although it doesn't get publicized very much, that the Russians have 30 nuclear-powered icebreakers active in the Canadian Arctic, and they have a massive carrier up there, battleship up there. That is nuclear powered. Canada only has a couple of broken down diesel ships, and we have an ice station up there that has been long since abandoned. And so there really isn't much defense going on of that part of the continent. And so I actually think what Donald Trump is signaling is something that I've been talking about for a while, and that is, unfortunately, the domestic politics of Canada are very much in the globalist vein. This is something that the Trump administration is very much opposed to. And I think the way that Canada is being governed poses a geopolitical threat to the safety and security of the United States. Don't forget, one of the people who ran for prime minister recently, ran for the leadership of the Liberal Party against Mr. Carney, who only 7% of Canadians know who he is Chrystia Freeland. And during the leadership debates, she actually said that if she became our prime minister, she would form military alliances with European nuclear powers and have them put nukes on the ground along the 49th parallel and point them due south. So I think what Donald Trump is mostly concerned about, and he should rightly be concerned about, is what's going on in Canada. How does it impact the safety and security of the United States and of Americans and Canadians, for that matter? And as a Canadian, I can tell you, I'm actually grateful for the interest that Donald Trump is taking in Canada and in Canadians, because it surpasses anything that any Canadian politician has done in the last 10 years.
Okay, we'll wait and see how all this plays out. I know you have an election coming up on April 28th. That's Prime Minister Carney called that early. We'll see how what Canadians think about that and which route they choose. So, Leighton Gray of the Gray Matter podcast, thank you for sharing your insights. We appreciate you.
That's been my privilege. Thank you.
Are activist judges trying to block the Trump administration's immigration, DOJ, cultural, and defense policies? The country's already seen court rulings putting a halt to deportations, DOJ access to government finances, and transsexuals in the military. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt refers to the rogue judges as part of the resistance to Trump movement.
Almost every single one of them is a registered Democrat, has been involved in Democrat campaigns or causes, have donated to Democrat candidates. Some of them have even put their anti-Trump bias on social media. They have not been shy about their hatred for this president and his policies, and they are abusing their judicial power.
Joining us with more is former Trump legal advisor Jenna Ellis, who currently serves as senior advisor of public policy at the American Family Association. Jenna, thanks for being with us. So do you agree with Caroline Leavitt? Are these judges, activists, Democrats trying to stop Trump's agenda through the judiciary?
Well, thanks for having me, Gary. And I do agree with the White House, but I think it goes even deeper than that. The leftist agenda for decades has been anti-Constitution and just preferred outcome. That's what it means to be an activist, that they just want to get to their preferred outcome regardless of what the rule of law says. And so we see that even with the lawfare that was against President Trump, it doesn't matter what the rule says. It just matters what outcome they prefer. And so judges shouldn't be activists. They shouldn't be making decisions based on political preferences classes or categories. They should be following the rule of law so that it ensures that we as Americans can truly have a well-ordered society.
Well, let's look at a couple of these. Polls show a majority of Americans support the deportation of criminal illegal immigrants. So is there any legal basis for judges to stop deportation? It seems a valid argument can be made that judges are venturing into the foreign policy arena, seizing powers that belong to the president. Your thoughts?
Yes, especially the D.C. District Court Judge, Judge Boasberg, who Congressman Brandon Gill is filing impeachment articles against. And I fully support that because that is the remedy that our founders provided for activists or anyone in federal elected office, an officer under the United States Constitution that goes well outside the scope of their authority. And so let's just take that instance. Article 3 judges cannot second guess the execution of policy. That's a decision that we, the people, made when we elected Donald Trump in November. So it's not just that this is a policy preference that the majority of Americans support. It's that Donald Trump was elected to office to execute the office and the powers that are given to him as the president under Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution. That's not for Article 3 judges to second guess or to determine their opinion and stop him based on their own policy preferences.
I think the same argument can be made about the judge blocking Pete Hegseth and the DOD from implementing a ban on transsexuals in the U.S. military. Defense Secretary Hegseth suggested that the judge should report for duty since she's now a military planner. But isn't a judge acting within their authority, though, Jenna, when they believe the Pentagon is making unconstitutional military decisions?
Well, we have to understand what the term unconstitutional means. Again, the left has tried to harness that language and redefine it. It's not a matter of what anyone believes should happen in the policy realm. It's what an officer under the Constitution can do with their limited powers that are given to them under the U.S. Constitution. And so if Pete Hegseth, as the DOD secretary, can instruct his agency in a certain way, then it's not for our Article 3 or federal judges to second guess that. Whether or not he should is the policy question that they can't contemplate. And so the only way that it becomes unconstitutional is if he goes outside the scope of what executive authority, the limits and the guardrails of what executive authority is given to a president and his subordinates under Article 2. And so as Americans, we need to go back to our U.S. Constitution, understand the limited and separate powers that our founders provided so we understand how and where judges can act, what's within the scope of their jurisdiction and judicial review, and what isn't, and what makes them activists.
Okay, looking at remedies, you already talked about impeachment, but House Speaker Mike Johnson says Congress has broad authority over the federal courts and can eliminate an entire district court by pulling their funding. So is that a possible solution to stopping judicial activism? What do you see happening there?
That's one possibility. So under the Constitution in Article 3, only the U.S. Supreme Court and justices, but it's not numbered. So we could have more than 9 justices, for example. That's all done through the legislature, through Congress, and currently the Judiciary Acts. And so if Congress wants to revisit the circuit courts, they want to revisit funding, all of those things, they absolutely can under the Constitution. And Congressman Andy Biggs also floated another solution, which I think is a very interesting legal question. He's now running for Arizona state governor, but he suggested that because Article 3 judges only are given a lifetime term of good behavior, that Congress, by simple majority resolution, if they find that those judges are not acting within good behavior, whatever that means, then they could simply pass a resolution based on a simple majority to eliminate and remove those judges. And so that, of course, would be far easier than the impeachment process and would also be far easier to get through the filibuster that's in the Senate.
Finally, I've got to ask you, you recently wrote an op-ed about President Joe Biden's use of the auto pen to sign presidential pardons. Does the law require the president to personally sign the pardons and legislation? And why would an auto pen invalidate the pardon or legislation?
I don't believe that it does, and we've seen historical examples of the use of an auto pen. So I don't think that it runs afoul of the presentment clause or any other constitutional parameters just solely based on the use of the auto pen. Where I think the legal question gets interesting and ventures into the realm of possibly voiding those pardons is if Joe Biden didn't himself order them, if he didn't form the requisite mental intent and discretion that is only given by the Constitution to a president. He can't delegate it. It's called the non-delegable doctrine. And so if his staff was making these orders and pardons by use of an auto pen without his authorization or authority, then they would have been circumventing the power that's vested only in a president of the United States. And that could render those pardons or executive orders voidable.
Okay, we'll see what happens there. Jenna Ellis of the American Family Association, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary.
This week, a French court barred conservative politician Marine Le Pen from seeking office for 5 years. Members of Le Pen's National Rally Party condemned the court ruling, arguing that it undermines the rule of law and is intended to influence the upcoming presidential election. Conservatives have made significant gains in France in recent years, and Le Pen, as the leading National Rally candidate, was anticipated to lead her party to victory. However, she'll now spend the next 2 years under house arrest, wearing an ankle monitor due to accusations of embezzling European Union funds. Le Pen is alleged to have used EU money to pay her party staff instead of designating it for EU aids. Jordan Bardella, the leader of the National Rally, stated that the court decision signifies a replacement of the rule of law with judicial tyranny. Sound familiar? Speaking to the media in the Oval Office, President Trump commented on the French court's ruling concerning Le Pen.
That's a very big deal. I know all about it, and a lot of people thought she wasn't going to be convicted of anything, and I don't know if it means conviction, but she was banned for running for 5 years, and she's the leading candidate. That sounds like this country. That sounds very much like this country.
Yes, it does, similar to the investigations and court cases aimed at preventing Donald Trump from winning a second term. Additionally, members of the Liberal Party in France have labeled members of Le Pen's National Rally Party as Nazis and fascists. Folks, brace yourselves. The deep state pushback is happening not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And just like in the U.S., the French judiciary is becoming the preferred tool used by elites and bureaucrats to undermine those who seek to replace them. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Until next time, be blessed.